I didn't have a report in this year's Field Days Bulletin, basically because my report is we planted the trees and they're still alive. So if you remember last year, I talked about my strawberry project, and if you had any strawberries this morning and with the donuts, those were picked this morning from that project. The strawberries were in our third and final year of that research project. The plants are starting to look a little bit rough, but that's sort of what we expected. Growers usually get about 3 years of production out of their plants before they dig them up and replant, and that's where we're at with that project. But the plants are still going. I'm still picking 8 to 10 pounds of strawberries every week out of one of our high tunnels. So, and we get production basically May through the last 2 years. We've gotten production into November. So a high tunnel that's going to give you 8 to 10 pounds of strawberries for 5 to 6 months out of the year is a pretty good use of space. And so that project has turned into a really nice project. And my fingers are often stained red, and it's not because I was getting in fights with anybody. It's because I spent the morning picking strawberries. But anyway, that was a specialty crop grant through the Wyoming Department of Ag Specialty Crop Grant Program. And my latest adventure with them was funding that they provided for an apple variety study. And so this spring we planted a total of 63 trees, 15 different apple varieties. The idea of the study is basically to help us develop a list of recommended apple varieties for Wyoming. There aren't a lot of fruit trees that do well in cold environments. Apples and pears are among those that do well, and you see growing across the state of Wyoming. But as far as I could tell, there's, as far as apple production and documentation of apple varieties that do well, I talked to people who've grown apples here in Wyoming. I talked to some of the nurseries who sell apple trees around Wyoming, and used that information to help me select the varieties that we chose for the study. We chose varieties that we thought would have the best chance of surviving here in Wyoming, but again, I don't think the study's been done, and so that's why we're doing it, so we have some data to back up the information. And of course, people are interested in growing fruit and fruit trees. And so anyway, that's a short report. I couldn't remember the 15 varieties we planted, so I'll just read them to you off my list. We planted Fuji, which you've probably seen at the grocery store. Some varieties that I recognize, some new varieties that I had never heard of before, but taking recommendations from growers who thought that these would be good varieties, and taking their advice. So again, Fuji, Ben Davis, a yellow transparent, which my mom told me she had on her farm when she was a kid. So that one's been around for a long time. Orleans Antique, Enterprise, Arkansas Black, Cortland, Liberty, Freedom, Macintosh, another older variety. Liberty and Freedom have been around for a while too. Zestar, maybe the one I'm most excited about, Honeycrisp. A lot of people have told me those do well here. So we've planted 6 Honeycrisp apples out here. Snappy Mac, that's a new variety. I'd never even heard of it before. Lodi, another older variety, a yellow apple, and Harrell Red, which is another sort of standard that's been grown around the Laramie area for quite a while. So we only have one location. We talked about planting orchards around at our different research stations. The funding, trees were expensive. Basically, I had enough funding to plant these 63 trees, to hire some help, to install a drip irrigation system, to control weeds. And I thought, well, if the apples will grow here in Laramie, they'll grow anywhere else in the state too. So we'd get probably different or maybe better results in other parts of the state, but we'll definitely get the toughest of the tough apple tree varieties if they survive here. So like I said, they were just planted this spring. We put them in the ground. We ordered bare root plants from a nursery in Montana and another nursery from Missouri. The trees came in bare root. We got them in the ground. We planted the south field. It's kind of a triangular field with the ball diamond as the backdrop. So those home runs that come over the fence are going to knock some of the apples off of my trees. And then we planted 24 trees over in that triangle. We planted another 21 trees at the south end of this long high tunnel. And then we planted 18 dwarf trees along the fence row at the north end of the farm along Harney. The dwarf trees we planted separately for a couple reasons. One, thought it would make a nice sort of attractive screen along the fence there. So just to help with the looks of the farm. But we also didn't really expect the dwarf trees to survive very long. Producers, growers, it's sort of common knowledge that dwarf trees tend to be weaker trees, and so they'll do well in more mild climates. California, the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and situations like that, dwarf trees are going to do fine. But in a harsher environment, growing conditions here in Wyoming, our suspicion is that the dwarf rootstock just isn't going to be well suited. But again, it's part of a study, and if they do fine, great. If they don't, same. We have the documentation, and we can help make those recommendations to growers and homeowners who want to grow fruit trees in their backyard. Try these. Don't try these other varieties or rootstock. So anyway, that's basically what we're doing, is looking at different varieties and different rootstock in terms of winter hardiness. So next year I'll be able to tell you which of those varieties survived their first winter in Laramie, and it's a 3-year study. And so again, we'll collect that data and help us put together a list. That orchard, though, is going to stay. The plan is that Acres took part of their farm out of vegetable production and turned that into an apple orchard. And then the triangle piece by the ball diamond was not being used at the time, so they didn't have to give up any space for that section of the orchard. But after the 3-year study, the trees will stay. I'll probably continue to use that orchard as an outdoor classroom, pruning workshops, pest management in orchards, and that sort of thing. And then the Acre students will probably harvest the apples once they come into production. They say 3 to 5 years before you really start getting production off of the trees. And they'll have those apples to sell at the farmers markets. For those of you who are CSA members through Acres, you probably look forward to having some apples in your CSA shares in the future too, as well. So yeah, I guess that's about it with the apples. It's a pretty exciting study. I've enjoyed the strawberries because I've also gotten to take strawberries home with me for the last 3 years. I have to wait 5 years for my apples, but eventually, at one of these field days, I'll bring some apples for us to snack on as well. I'd also like to introduce Hannah Dunn. She's the farm manager for Acres this summer. She's done a great job, and as well as the crew that they've got working out there helping with the weeding, the watering, the planting, everything that I've been doing out there this summer with the strawberries and the apples. They've all been a great help. And then Hannah's got her hands full with at least a dozen other things out there with all of the production that they have going on out there. So if any of you are interested, you're all welcome to come over when we finish up here. We'll give a little bit of a walking tour. You can check out the orchard, the strawberries, and see the other vegetable production that's happening out here at Acres. So, any questions about the apples, strawberries?
Yeah, Chris, will your project tie into Steve Miller's work at all?
So Steve's really looking at, his Wyoming apple project is looking at a lot of the older heritage apples that are found around the state, and I'm looking at really more of the newer varieties that are suited for Wyoming. I'm going to use some of Steve's information because he's identified some of those varieties, and obviously they're going to be cold hardy and known to be productive in Wyoming. So I'll use some of his information, but this research is really separate from what he's doing, or in addition to, I should say. Yeah. Great, thanks. So initially we had to get water out here. There was no water on this side of the road. They had water up here, but there was only one hydrant. to water this whole farm. So this spring, we had a water line installed that tapped into the greenhouse, and they put these new boxes in. There's one on this side of the road and one over here. And this is my water supply for both of the orchards. So I didn't have to take water away from the farm to water the trees, and they still had the water they needed to water their vegetables and everything else they're growing. You can see that, so we just ran it's a 2-inch line that they ran out here, and then I tapped into it, just a garden hose with a drip line attached to it, and I can just turn them on and water my trees. So we generally don't recommend drip systems for watering trees. For young trees, since the root system is pretty small, these were all bare root plants. The 2 rings, they have emitters spaced every 12 inches, so they're, I know if I let this run for, and they put out 1 gallon per hour, 0.95 gallons per hour. So there are 13 emitters on each tree. Every hour I run this, I'm giving the trees 13 gallons of water. We usually water for an hour twice a week, is what we've been doing this spring with the drip system. You can see over here we put the mulch down and then the drip system. Over here we put the drip system in and the mulch is on top of it. I'm curious to see how this stuff holds up over the winter, but my plan is not to rip this drip system out and to leave it over the winter. I think UV is probably going to be the most damaging thing to the line. So if I was going to do it over, I would have put all of the drip lines under the mulch just so they're not sitting out baking in the sun.
We could still cover them with mulch too, and I think that we probably will.
Yeah.
The only problem that I foresee with that is because when we first put these together, one of them kept popping off over there because of the water pressure. So if it was under the mulch, you might not notice that it's broken, and that's the only thing I could think of which would be a downfall to that.
So then I did also put a pressure reducer on here so that the water pressure wasn't an issue. So it doesn't look like, if you just look at these emitters, it doesn't look like they're doing much. You pick it up, you can see the water dripping right off of it. So it's actually, putting out a significant amount of water. And by my calculations, I could water, with the water supply I have here, I could water about 75, 76 trees with this setup. So I have plenty of water to water the trees. There's 24 here and 21 there, and they're on different zones. So, the water pressure, water quantity isn't an issue. The map will show you what the varieties are. Oh, the other thing I'll point out is that there were a couple different, so there were all bare root, sort of standard bare root trees, which are going to come to you looking like these trees over here. It's just a trunk with very few, if any, lateral branches on it. So they have these trees were ordered through Burpees, Stark Brothers out of Missouri. They have their dwarf trees, and then their semi-dwarf trees, and then they have their semi-dwarf Supremes. So for a $5 difference, you get a tree that's taller, thicker caliper, and quite a few lateral branches. So these trees are a year or two at least ahead of those trees. So, if you're going to pay $30 for a tree or $35 for a tree, I'd spend the extra $5 and get the Supreme, is what they call it. But I couldn't get all of the varieties. They weren't all available in that. So anyway, we planted these. They were ordered in March or April. Trees came in end of May. We actually potted them up into large, like 5-gallon buckets, and stored them in the high tunnel until end of May, early June, just to give them a little protection from that beautiful spring weather that we can get here in Laramie. And then put them in the ground early June, once the weather, hopefully was going to stay warm, and it has. So we tilled our planting strips in this field to kill the grass and the weeds, and then plant into that. And this field, this was a field that was in production in the past, where they've grown fruits and vegetables out here. So it just really needed to be weeded, and we actually sprayed Roundup in this field to kill the thistle and the grasses, and the herbicide did a really good job of killing those weeds. And now you can see the purslane and the other weeds that have started to creep in. And my plan is to actually spray it again this fall, and then plant some grasses, a grass mix with probably some clover in it in between the tree rows to get something growing in there and keep the weeds. Something growing in there that doesn't need a lot of water, and it'll keep the weeds down. So that's the plan with this fall. The other thing is I did stake these trees initially. See one that I forgot to pull up right here. Because that week that we planted was particularly windy. A couple days after we planted, all the trees were leaning the same direction. So I came back and I staked them, and I just pulled the stakes up last week off of these trees. They're rooted well enough that, you know, the wind's not going to blow them over at this point. And Hannah told me that there aren't any straight rows anywhere out here at Acre. So if we got a tree that's leaning, it would just fit right in. So.
Let's keep it interesting.
So I'll let Hannah take it over from here and tell you a little bit more about what's happening at Acres. And as we go down to the other end of the farm, I'll show you the dwarf apple trees down there. And we'll walk by the strawberry tunnel as well. And then this last row of trees, these are the dwarf apple trees that on the back side of your map has the varieties listed. But there's six varieties, 3 of each variety planted here. So we planted 18 trees along the fence row. And I didn't trellis them this year, but the plan is if they do survive, I'll put a trellis in. I wanted to see, before I invested the time and money into it, I wanted to see if they survived the first year first. You don't really need the trellis until they start producing, but on these dwarf trees, the weight of the fruit will actually pull the tree down. But the trellis will also help you train it and prune it as well. So if they survive, we're going to install a trellis and kind of grow them on a flat plane on that trellis and create a nice apple wall screen along the fence here at Harney. So anyway, that's the plan.